Consider supporting Archaeosoup on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description.
This is Dispatch Alpha 37 Echo Bravo, Moon Recon Station, designation Glean, forward Archaeological Assessment Unit, beginning transmission. The Council will be well aware that it is the axiom of archaeology that we, for the most part, study rubbish. Archaeologists have known this since the time of the hallowed Mick Aston and the Time team. However, while all archaeology can be classed as rubbish, things left behind, there was, it seems, a time approximately 1,000 years before humanity finally departed Earth that there was more rubbish than ever before. In this dispatch, therefore, it is proposed that the Council considers that this may have been the age of the Great Middens, humanity's peak rubbish output. The digital archive shows us that even 19th, 20th and 21st century archaeologists were aware that their hominin ancestors produced rubbish, often found in the form of stone flakes, leftover material from stone tool making. This so-called debitage often comprised the evidence for some of these ancient ancestral species. Wherever hominins went, their rubbish followed with them. However, in later prehistory, it is clear that as people began to settle in one place, experimenting with farming and even making the occasional metal tool, rubbish would amass. Small middens would build up in pits around primitive houses. As the millennia proceeded, the problem seemingly got worse and worse. By medieval times, it is clear that people were throwing their rubbish out of windows into the street. This was truly a grim time for human hygiene. And so, driven partly by population growth and partly by a perceived lack of options, the capacity for human society to generate rubbish and to store that rubbish somewhere, anywhere, it seems, only grew and grew. By the early 21st century, most population centres had vast middens associated with them, notably not easily visible from those population centres, but they were there. And in fact, when we look at the artefacts in the middens, it is clear that humans were more obsessed with cleanliness than ever before. Perhaps they knew that there was just so much rubbish around and they needed to be aware of cleanliness, or perhaps they genuinely believed they were cleaner than their ancestors. It is hard to know for sure, but there was a lot of it. In truth, the designation of waste materials at this time is seemingly quite random. Within the fairly structured deposition that we see in these middens, we often come across materials such as plastic boxes, furniture, electronic artifacts, and other materials that are in fact quite usable and useful. This is a confusing element. Perhaps we are seeing a form of deposition, some sort of sacrifice. Perhaps there was a limit on how many plastic boxes perhaps a household was allowed to own. Nonetheless, the number of materials that we find that don't appear to be actually damaged, broken, soiled, or beyond repair is astonishing. This, of course, was an archaic time prior to comprehensive 3D printing and matter reclamation technologies. But we do see some attempts to separate out different types of material at this time. Even attempts perhaps to reuse material. Metals, for example, are separated and crushed. But again, this could be some form of specific conscious deposition, again, a sacrifice of sorts. It's hard to know, but seemingly people were associated with these middens and were managing them in some way, from season to season, following great festivals at winter time, or great movements of people in the summer, for example. When material came into these middens, it seems that this material was to a certain extent being sorted, or at the very least being carefully placed into the midden. References from this time are confusing and conflicting. It is clear that in the South American continent there were some people who were surviving on these middens, actively sorting through the material as a living of sorts. And yet in the northern hemisphere there are only vague stories of people living in so-called dumps. It's unclear whether these two groups were aware of one another. Perhaps stories of the Great Middens in the South American continent had reached the north, and this was seen as a mystery, some sort of mythical group of individuals. We will never know for sure. Nevertheless, it is clear that these were considered strange places to live, dirty places, unclean places. So, whatever the case may be, most people did not want to live on or around the Middens. This archaeologist therefore humbly submits for the Council's consideration that the 20th and 21st centuries be considered a time of peak archaeological and rubbish output for humanity. Of course, for us, looking back, these are great wells of potential in terms of data and reconstructing lifestyles of our ancestors. But this archaeologist cannot help but wonder what this meant for humanity at the time. What was life like with and amongst the Great Middens? The Age of the Great Middens. This has been a dispatch for the Council's consideration. Moon Recon Station Clean, signing off.